Welcome to Podcast UK.
In this, one of our shorter Cappuccino Break episodes, we invite you to sit back and relax with your favourite hot drink and enjoy this mini podcast on plastic surgery.
The management of hand fractures seems to cause so much consternation and confusions amongst trainees, and indeed among some consultants as well. But before we decide on what sort of fracture fixation to utilize for a fracture of a hand bone, we need to first decide if the fracture needs surgery at all. Hi, I'm Mr Majumder, a plastic surgery consultant hand surgeon from Yorkshire in the UK, and in this short Cappuccino Break podcast, I shall outline the algorithm which has helped me make this decision for over 25 years. This simple yet very elegant algorithm was developed by my plastic surgery consultant hand surgeon colleague Stephen Southern. So let's get going. The algorithm relies upon two questions. The first question is the fracture in an acceptable position? By acceptable position, we mean that were the fracture to be left in that position, it would heal and not negatively impact upon hand function. So, examples of unacceptable positions are, for instance, where the bony ends are not in contact, so the fracture would not heal. Another example is, for instance, where the fracture has caused a rotational deformity of a digit resulting in scissoring. In this situation, the fracture might heal, but with malunion and adversely affect hand function if a digit curls under another and gets in the way. Now, the answer to the question, is it in an acceptable position, could be yes, it could be no, and of course, it could be we're not quite sure. Now, if the answer is yes, we progress to the second question in the algorithm, which we shall discuss shortly. If their answer is no, then the fracture needs to be reduced, which means the bones need to be realigned into an acceptable position, where they shall heal but not cause any impairment of hand function. Once the bones have been set into this acceptable position, we can then go on to the second question. If, however, the answer to the question is neither yes nor no, but rather we are not sure, then further imaging, such as a CT scan for instance, may be required to help us make that decision. And once further imaging has been obtained, we go back to asking the question as to whether the fracture is in an acceptable position, and hopefully we should have enough information to decide whether it is a yes or a no. Now, once the fracture is in an acceptable position, we then have to ask the second question, which is the fracture stable? What the stability question is trying to answer is if the patient undergoes supervised mobilization of the hand, will the fracture continue to remain in an acceptable position, in which case the fracture is stable, or will mobilization of the hand cause the fracture to slip into an unacceptable position, in which case the fracture is deemed unstable. We know that certain fracture configurations, such as impacted fractures, are more likely to be stable, while others, such as a spiral or oblique fractures, are more likely to be unstable. But the decision regarding the stability should be made taking into consideration not only the radiological findings, but also information from the history, such as the mechanism of the injury and information gleaned from the examination findings as well. For instance, a twisting injury is more likely to give you an unstable fracture, whilst the impacted fifth metacarpal neck fracture from the axial loading of a punch injury is more likely to give you a stable fracture. Again, we have three possible answers to the question: yes, no, and unsure. Now, if the answer is yes, then the patient can be referred directly to the hand therapist for supervised mobilization, possibly with the judicious use of splintage as necessary. Now, if the answer to the stability question, however, is no, that is to say the fracture is not stable, then the fracture would need to be stabilized. There are of course several ways to stabilize the fracture, from non-invasive techniques such as casting or splintage, to surgical procedures using K-wires, plates or screws, etc. As I tell my trainees, one fracture, 5 hand surgeons, at least 6 different options of fixation. But whichever method of stabilization is employed, the patient must then go on to have mobilization of the hand under hand therapy supervision. This is because if an injured hand is completely immobilized until the fracture heals, the risk of a stiff digit or hand is very high and can be catastrophic for the function of the hand. It is imperative that whichever stabilization technique is utilized, it must allow for mobilization. Of course, it can be the case that we are not sure if the fracture is stable. In this scenario, further imaging may be helpful in determining whether the fracture is stable. I find dynamic imaging using a C-arm is particularly helpful as the fractured bone can be imaged in real time to ascertain if the fracture fragments move whilst the injured digit or hand is mobilized passively or actively. Obviously, anesthesia may be required to ensure that the examination is not painful, and Wallant can be quite useful. If, even after further imaging, the decision regarding stability is still inconclusive, a not unreasonable approach may be to commence supervised mobilization but monitor the fracture closely over the next few weeks using repeated regular assessment, both clinical and radiological, to determine whether the fracture remains in an acceptable position and whether it remains stable, and then reuse the algorithm as necessary to determine further management for the patient. To summarize and to re-emphasize, the fracture needs to be in an acceptable position and be stable enough to allow mobilization. The desired end result of the management of a hand fracture is good function. A heel fracture alone is not enough. The injured digit and hand needs to have optimal movement and not be stiff. The caveat to the aforementioned is, of course, that any recommendation for the management of a fracture of a hand bone needs to take into consideration the general health of the patient and the pre-injury functional status of the injured limb. I hope this helps. Happy fracture management.
Podplast UK is a collaboration between UK plastic surgery trainees and consultants. The content reflects individuals' practice and opinions may vary. If you have any feedback, do get in touch. We hope that this has been interesting and useful. If it has, remember to follow us for future sessions.